Freeze or share my bed. On a night when the cowboy was alone and covered in snow, the Apache woman made a demand. Please remember to like the video and let us know where you're watching from in the comments section before we get started with the story. In late December of 1881, the Wyoming Territory was under weeks of wind and snow. Color was stolen from the upper plains. There was only brown rock, white ground, and a gray sky. It had not been ingested by the drifts. Over the past few years, the winters had become more difficult. Or perhaps that was simply how Matthew Cole sensed them. He was a 36-year-old guy who had endured his sorrow for too long. He had once been a father and a husband. Fever had killed his wife, their young boy, a few days later. 3 winters had passed since then. Since then, his life has been relegated to ensuring he woke up to another day, feeding his horses and keeping his cabin standing. He didn't have a drink. He was not a gambler. Towns carried people, and people meant questions, so he didn't go looking for them. He had nowhere else to go, so he stayed, and it was simpler to remain silent than to respond to inquiries. Half of his cabin sat. He had cut himself a mile off the pine-built trail. A single room with a low ceiling. There was a stove that provided the sole warmth, a table, 2 seats, and a plank bed against the wall. It served as a location for survival, not for survival. He had come to terms with that. Now his task was straightforward. Make it through the winter. If you chop enough, the stove was never cold. To ensure the horses survive till spring, keep them fed. Keep quiet, and hope the loneliness didn't make him feel even more alone. The storm had been present the night the knock came, constructing since evening. Like a steady hand, the wind rose, slamming into the walls, rattling the shutters, and trembling. The door latch. Snow swept across the windows in a sideways motion and filled. No matter how many times he patched the wood cracks, the powder would still sift through. At the table he sat with a low-burning light, repairing a leather strap with thread and needle. Out of habit, the gun propped up next to him. The only other sound coming from the stove was the fire popping. He initially believed he was dreaming. A thud against the door, weak in the tempest. The needle was halfway through the leather when he froze. Next, another knock sounded, this one genuine and urgent. His chest grew constricted. Nobody showed up. This far without justification. Furthermore, he had long since discovered that reason was rarely sound. He grasped the weapon. He walked silently across the room, the wood of the stock worn smooth against his palm. He stood at the door and listened. For the wind was the only thing present. 3 knocks later, uneven and weaker this time. Rifle tilted but not lifted. He jerked the door open by pulling the lock. There was a woman, half buried in the snow. As though the storm itself were pushing her in his direction, she leaned forward. Her black, long hair clung to her face was covered in frozen threads. She had bronze skin. The cold caused her lips to break, and even when her body trembled, her gaze remained unbroken, black and keen, directly onto his. She was dressed in a deerskin outfit that was lightly adorned and fringed. Beautiful beadwork, but the hem and collar were ripped. The fabric clung to her curves and was rigid with cold, where her chest was where the seams had torn. Her cleavage was not intended to be enticing, but it was impossible to disregard it. An indication of the garment's weak resistance to the cold. She spoke in a harsh, hoarse-arrow voice. It had slit her throat open. Freeze or share my bed. For an instant, his intuition was to close the door. He had established his own regulations. Nobody else. No entanglements. No cause for optimism. He had promised himself that he would never be accountable for a different existence. His heart pounded and a flash of panic passed through him, at the idea of someone entering the lodge and entering his solitude. However, his gaze caught her trembling. Shoulders. The searing crimson of her fingers curled at her sides, and her breath came shallowly. If he abandoned her, she would be dead before dawn there. He was aware of it. He took a step back, lowered the weapon, and remained silent. She swiftly crossed the threshold, as though she was aware that he might decide to change his mind at any time. She was struck by the stove's heat, and she turned to face him after gasping and briefly closing her eyes. Snow landed on the flooring from her hair. Her ripped dress was clinging to her as she tightened her arms around herself. In contrast to her body, weary but resolute, her gaze remained fixed on him. She seems to have been instructed to beg, and decided to give orders instead. In order to protect the door from the storm, Matthew putting the rifle down, he examined her under the lantern's light. She was young, perhaps 24 as he could see. Apache, he thought, based on her appearance and demeanor. If there were people out there searching for her, that would be problematic. But she was by herself, He went to the bed and picked up a blanket and put it beside the stove. Pulling it over her shoulders, she sat carefully, yet never took her eyes off of him. Returning to the fire, he ladled the thin stew into a tin dish and placed it in silently in front of her. After a brief moment of hesitation, she picked it up with both hands and took a sip. Her eyes barely softened, but he could feel the warmth and relaxation in her shoulders. Permeated her. With his arms folded, he watched her eat while leaning on the table. Despite his composure, his mind was racing. Face. Who was she? What brought her here? Was she being pursued? He had no responses, but merely the feeling that she had been brought to his door by the storm without any prior notice or opportunity to refuse. He felt his chest tighten once more. This time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, not panic. The agitation of accountability. The cabin groaned beneath the weight of the increasing wind. He fed the stove by stoking it. Additional wood. And she was standing now with the blanket still in place as he turned around. Her shoulders. Without asking, she walked over to his bed. She slipped beneath the covers after removing them, still. Her eyes were steady and black as she watched him. She made room next to her, evident in what she anticipated. Thoughts heavy, breath tight, Matthew stood motionless. In that bed, he recalled his wife, the warm evenings before to the illness. He recalled cradling his child till he became motionless. His hand shook. Against the chair's back. His entire being wished for the wall to remain intact, but the storm. Not showing any signs of slowing down, they pressed on the cabin. There the woman laid with her. Her body was tightly wrapped in the blanket. Her eyes were half lit by the lantern, and possessing both terror and authority. Finally, he went slowly and deliberately, boots still on, and took a seat at the bed's edge. She moved in closer, grazing his arm with her shoulder. Her warmth permeated him, her breathing steady but silent. Neither one said anything. The storm engulfed the fire burned low and there was silence. With all of his muscles tensed and his thoughts divided, Matthew gazed at the ceiling. The sheer fact that she was alive because he had allowed her in, and the horror of what this implied. For tonight, that was plenty. The cabin wasn't deserted for the first time in 3 winters. Throughout the night, the storm persisted. It scratched at snow over the barred windows, rattled the roof beams, and rocked the cabin walls until even the lantern light appeared to have been swallowed. The air within got closer from the stove, and there was a subtle scent of her wet garment was slowly drying, the wetness mingled with wood smoke. With one side of the body, Matthew was motionless. His rear half was facing the woman next to him as he lay in bed with his boots still on. Her warmth pushed through to him. The thin cloth and blanket layers. Whenever she moved, his muscles tight, remembering the scene where the bed had been, where he and his wife had previously shared it. She was taken by illness. He made an effort to remain motionless, staring at the ceiling beams. However, his heart was against him. She was near enough for her steady, genuine breath to touch his shoulder, and it had been years since a human had slept next to him. A part of him wanted to retreat, to hold on to that wall, of stillness unbroken, but another, more subdued but unyielding, urged him to allow her to remain. She had partially arrived at his door. Frozen. He was aware that she would have already been buried beneath the snow if he had excluded her. He remained where he was because of it alone. Neither of them spoke as the night dragged on slowly. He observed minor elements that hoped he didn't. Her shoulders occasionally shivered, her hair dried in streaks on the blanket, though there was no protection from the ripped fabric that curved her chest. Shameful of himself, he pushed his eyes away even though he was just a man attempting to maintain authority. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, restless. The world outside was buried deep, but by daybreak the storm had subsided. The quiet following the wind seemed weighty, as if the air itself was holding its breath. First to stand, Matthew tugged on putting wood in the stove, putting his coat on, and lighting another lamp. He looked at her as she remained in bed. She was awake, eyes wide, intently observing him. Her face was suddenly more colorful. The cold no longer cracked her lips. Slowly she sat up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Matthew finally stated, "I need to know your name," in a stern but quiet manner. She paused as if choosing to provide it or not. "Nia," she replied. The word was powerful. Despite her gruff speech, Matthew gave her a single nod. "You come from a band nearby." She shook her head. "No," My she tightened her grip around the edge of the floor as she gazed at the individuals scattered, some dead, some abducted. Blanket. Men followed me for many days, but I lost them in the storm. Provided the answers to the concerns he had been wondering about all night. Why she had visited his door. Why she was not here by accident. She had been running, and she carried herself as if she were accustomed to battling for her own life, and she had been pushed into his path by the storm. Matthew filled 2 tin cups with coffee and placed one down for her. Slowly extended his hand, his gaze never leaving his, as though he was still uncertain if he would. She sipped, squinting at the heat, but her shoulders didn't move. He didn't. After a lengthy pause, Matthew added, "You can stay until the storm breaks." His words felt a little more relaxed. Bringing someone into his cabin made them heavier than they should have been, since they contained a decision he hadn't intended to make. Entailed confronting questions he had repressed and altering the routine that had kept him steady for 3 winters. Nia examined him with those dark eyes, wondering if he was still able to care about another soul. Unblinking. She said, "I stay until I can walk without freezing." It wasn't a request or an expression of gratitude, simply a reality. Matthew felt that he recognized the flair of something in her tone, stubbornness, the drive to live, and he appreciated it even if it upset him. He took the stew pot off the burner and placed another serving in front of her. She took her time eating. Time, not as frantic as the previous evening. Matthew observed her as she was eating. Attire. In addition to being ripped, the dress was flimsy and unsuitable for the depth of Wyoming winter. She wouldn't last an hour if she went out in it again. He walked up to the little chest by the bed. "You'll need this," he replied, pulling out a wool shirt that was too big for her and sitting on the table. Her gaze shifted to the she looked to be torn between need and pride, reaching for the garment and then returning to him. As though the act alone cost money, she held the cloth in her hands and traced it with her fingertips. He watched as she tightened her grip, but she didn't put it on yet. The day went by in silence, only disturbed by the noise of household tasks. Matthew checked the horses in the lean-to, shoveled snow out of the door and stable, and until his arms hurt, he chopped wood. Every time he went back inside, she was beside the fire, occasionally observing him and other times gazing into the flames with a detached expression that conveyed more than she stated out loud. He didn't ask, but he understood what horror she had witnessed and what losses she carried. The burden of quiet, and at times it was simpler to bear it without speaking. Matthew sat at the table cleaning his rifle in the evening, when the wind had subsided enough to allow him to hear the creak of trees outside. With the blanket slung over her shoulders, Nia got up from her spot by the stove and approached him. She grabbed the shirt he had given her earlier and put it on over her ripped dress, the fabric dangling as she spoke. She sat across from him, hands on the table, loose on her body, but finally covering her shoulders. As she said, "You lost someone too." Matthew's hands froze on a weapon. He looked up, shocked, and for a moment he was briefly enraged, not at her, but at the pain her words continued to cause. And he recalled his wife's fevered skin, of the little hand of his boy becoming motionless in his own. He had not mentioned them to anyone since they passed away, forced his jaw to relax. "Yes," he finally answered, without further explanation. Nia did not. The fire burned low once more as the darkness crept in, and she only nodded as though she understood enough. Matthew removed his boots as they lay in bed and slowly reclined. She moved closer and he felt her warmth. He hadn't touched her yet, but her presence filled the void that had been inside him for too long. He listened to the silence while gazing at the ceiling beams and sensed something had changed already. The cabin was no longer only a place to stay. The following morning brought a faint silver light from a wan sun that was weak behind clouds. Across the plains, snow was higher than a man's head and deep against the cabin walls. Waste, knowing that it would be days before he could go. Matthew stood at the window, his breath hazing the glass as having already gone over the effort that would be required to keep the horses alive, he measured the drifts outdoors. Nia slowly sat up, her dark hair falling back behind him as he heard the sound of the blanket sliding on the bed. She appeared stronger than she had the previous evening, but her eyes were still drooping over the wool shirt he had given her, still possessed the keen awareness of someone accustomed to peril. Matthew felt the burden of accountability grow heavier. Keeping himself alive was no longer the only concern. She had claimed that men had followed her, and if that was accurate, the storm would not permanently stop them. He was plagued by questions. Who were they? How many were there? And why had he hadn't inquired the previous evening? but now he knew he would have. They drove her so far into the wilderness. "You'll tell me more," he said, as he turned away from the window, put on his coat, and began adding more wood to the stove. Nia gave him a steady glance before he said in a calm but serious tone, "They were traders," she finally answered, lowering her gaze. "Men who buy and sell. They wanted to exchange me. If they find me, they won't stop," she said, clenching her hands in her lap. "I ran when I could." Her remarks weighed heavily on Matthew, who had heard worse horrors before, and he felt a slow but steady roil of rage. Deep, but his expression remained composed. He understood what it meant. If she'd gotten away from them, those men would not forget, and it wouldn't just be her life on the line if they found her here. He suppressed a thought. He couldn't send when he allowed her to enter his home. He had already decided what would happen, so he prepared breakfast. They ate in silence while eating the leftover stew and thick cornbread slices from the skillet, but the quiet seemed different now. It conveyed a sense of comprehension, if not yet trust, between them. Nia ate slowly while her eyes moved. About the cabin, taking notes on everything as if she were learning it by heart, she appeared less. She sat with her shoulders square, although she was more protective than the previous evening, as though prepared for anything that might come up. Following their meal, Matthew mentioned the tasks, which included shoveling the entryway. The horses required water melted from the snow, and it was clear to open. He maintained his usual steady beat, but he now noticed that he was looking back toward the cabin more than once. He returned, half anticipating her departure and half concerned that she could still be too frail to care for herself. He found her inside, patching the sleeve with a needle and thread he had placed on the table, close to the fire. Of his shabby shirt, meticulously, her forehead strained in focus, stopped him for a second. His garments hadn't been touched since his wife, and the sight made him feel something he wasn't used to. Want to confess, but he was unable to take his eyes off of him. Nia saw his gaze, hesitated. She answered simply, "Better now," and handed the shirt back with a slight nod. He accepted it without responding, but his throat tightened, and he wanted to ask her more questions, like whether she had any family remaining and what she had planned after the snow fell. The only thing that mattered for the day was that she was here now, therefore he suppressed the want to melt. As nightfall dropped, the fire warmed the hut, and Nia stepped toward the stove. Her hair Matthew sat at the table with his hands resting heavily on the wood, her body silhouetted against the light. His mind racing. He was aware that if he saw her, men would inquire. Prejudice against Apache was savage and ruthless. She would be in danger again if he took her there. At least the cabin protected her here, even though it brought him closer to her demise. The silence was broken by Nia, who said, "You didn't ask me why I knocked." Matthew looked up, startled by her tone. "I chose this door, not just because of the storm," she said. I noticed smoke. Perhaps there was a heart in the man within, I thought. His steely, steady stare met his. The word hit him harder than he anticipated. "If I was wrong, I would have died at your step." He had attempted to live without need, and without letting anyone into his life for 3 winters. But now that he had her, as the wall he had constructed began to crumble across from him, he remained silent, but his jaw tightened, and when they lay in bed again that night, the silence between them was more intense. His hands clenched on the table, but not empty. Without hesitation, Nia moved closer, her palm grazing. Matthew felt her heartbeat on his arm, and at first he stiffened, but then he relaxed. Steadily and persistently through the intimacy, for the first time in years, he did not lie awake plagued by the past, but he closed his eyes and listened to the breath of the person next to him, thinking that tomorrow would bring up topics they couldn't both avoid, like the men pursuing her, what her stay would entail, but for tonight, they were both alive and neither had to deal with the storm alone himself.